Hello. I'm with you talking about chapter 2 in banks. It's not a very long chapter, and I don't see it as anything dramatic, but there are a few things I'd like to highlight. I hope this helps. I don't give you tests over all the stuff in the chapters, or I know some people do, some of the university classes. But in chapter 2, it talks about developing a multicultural curriculum. And I want to preface some ideas or some statements I want to make. One of those is that every time when we come up with the idea that we want to study another culture, we have to realize that our own culture has predisposed us to evaluate certain things we'll see or observe or behaviors that we'll tend to see those as how much are they like us, and by definition, whether that's good or bad. Okay. We try to stay on the continuum of how different it is, not try to make an evaluation of good or bad. But ultimately in our lives, of course, we have to make evaluations of what we think is good or bad for us. But I like to hold things and examine that culture and give it a full look, so that you that you don't engage in judgments. And that's where it talks about stereotypes and generalizations, and it talks also, I think, about facts versus concepts. So it does talk about the interdisciplinary value of studying a culture across disciplines, which in theory sounds wonderful, but when you're teaching in school, you probably don't have time to coordinate with the history teacher. They've got their curriculum, and the math and the history department can't do a math study of Mayan architecture and Mayan mathematics. Occasionally you get the opportunity to do that. Probably you need to do that in some way that is less something you teach in the room, but maybe a presentation or projects where you encourage kids to examine cross-disciplinary issues. A lot of those that are real common to us in cultures are food, music, dance, games that people play, their art. It's on page 35. They talk about these. And I always thought some of the richest ones, especially if you're an English teacher, you're reading literature, is that it's very natural to, in reading a book or a novel that obviously is genuine about a culture and explaining it, that you look at different aspects of the characters in the book, and then kids can go and explore different aspects, like if there's a dance, if their architecture is mentioned in there, customs, those things are rich in cross-disciplinary aspects that you can study within one particular class. There's a nice chart on page 36. It has culture in the center, and it has art, math, science, drama, PE, home ec, language arts, literature, social science, and music all around the outside. You could add more to that if you want. The joy in studying another culture is in exploring things that interest you. So I like it with a good library with nice culture versions of different aspects of other cultures. You could study communications. I always thought it was interesting with the Inca in Peru that they developed a rather mysterious way of carrying messages with little knotted strings. And I believe pretty much the way to understand those, that's been lost. But it was a code, and people could actually get information from those. It's almost kind of like digital, only it was knotted strings. for a long time, a lot of the really interesting things that may get your students interested is languages, hieroglyphics. I have somewhere, and I can't find it now, I have a book on hieroglyphics. It's really more of an activities book. And it has little ink stamps, and you can actually create your name in Egyptian hieroglyphics, which kind of combines sounds with phonetics with pictures. And it helps kids understand that you can study, you can look at even English and look at our alphabet and go back and kind of trace it. I have a book, which I won't get out now because then I'll be talking here all night, is a book called Mysteries of the Alphabet. And it shows like the A. If you think about an A, what does that look like? You know, you might say, well, a house or a gable on a house, or, you know, whatever, the truss. It actually is, you turn it upside down, it's the oxen with his yoke on him. And that's from the ancient Egyptian and the Middle East. And so the A eventually flipped over and became the A of our knowledge, of our use. Another one is the D, door. Literally was a door. The D represented a door. So even though we think that English is not a pictographic language like Chinese, where they originally had a tree, and then the glyph or the symbol became a concept and not just phonetic, but because I think they're a combination of that, of both picture and sound, that our own alphabet has all kinds of unusual origins. The Q with the little tail on it, you ever mention, you know, actually stands for a monkey. It's amazing to do this, and then you discover things. It's really interesting for kids to see something they're very familiar with and then see their own cultural objects redefined or the origins explored, and you see, oh, that's where that came from, you know. The N, I'm trying to think what N is. I can't recall N. I know F was a man praying, and that's in this book on Mystery of the Alphabet. So there are all kinds of interesting, and that's, you know, I'm just talking about alphabet and the origin of letters to make words. The study of words themselves, where did they come from? I think called theology, and that's incredible stuff. But most people write dictionaries who do that. And dictionaries, as Samuel Johnson once said in his great dictionary in 1755, that lexicographers or people that make dictionaries are probably the dullest of all people. Look up Samuel Johnson sometime. Quite a clever fellow in the middle of in England. He made the first dictionary and really helped us start putting the English language into some kind of organization. Facts and concepts. A fact is statistical. It's something that can be verified. There are no alternative facts, despite certain people in politics. Facts are facts. But concepts and opinions, which are very loose, obviously opinions, but concepts are things that we throw about. I always think of them like 10-pound manhole covers. You know, we'll say assimilation, acculturation, race, culture, values, all these terms. And we just kind of gloss over them, say, okay, values. And we don't put any specificity into those. But the word race, and I think I've mentioned this before, the word race is a social construction. It came about when people were trying to decide who is on top and who is on bottom in the culture. Some places it was by the color of their skin, with the white at the top, and the darker you got, the lower you were. But it doesn't always have to be that way. It depends on what part of the world you're in. Europeans and Americans had their version of history. If you go to Asia, you'll see another version of history. But the fact is that skin color is just genetically almost irrelevant, but it's very important for how people treat each other in society. But in fact, it genetically, the differences between us are so minor as to be unimportant. And so that's why the word race and talking about race, even on surveys, is so offensive to me. You know, I remember when I got my job at UNK, they had, you weren't required to do it, but they said, what are you? Are you white? Are you Asian? You know, etc. I didn't fill it in. And then after I was here about a month, someone came by and said, you didn't fill this in. I said, it's voluntary. I know, but you know, we try to keep stat. And so in other words, they wanted me to make a commitment to declaring myself white or Caucasian or whatever it was. And I said, well, why does it matter? Who cares? And of course they cared because they're trying to look at, you know, their hiring patterns and stuff. Because ultimately the people still use that because they don't know how to distinguish between people. That we want you to be different. We want you to say if you're different or not different and how much different you are in what category. It's very interesting, you know, pressured me to declare myself. They talk here about concepts and higher level concepts. I'm not going to argue these out on the video. Be here quite a while. Generalizations are come in different patterns. I think that's interesting, you know, page 41, they have some of that. What I think is important though is the word stereotype versus generalization. And here's how I define it. I define it like this. Generalization is when you encounter something, not even a group of people, but something, and you come up with some rule. I think all of the objects that I've encountered over there were all kind of rectangular on the end, but on the other end, they were kind of oval shaped. Okay, that's a generalization. Okay, a stereotype is when I tell you all the objects over there, I am immediately when I encounter something kind of looks like I assume it must have that same trait or those same, you know, shapes on it. Now, what's interesting about that is when it applies to race or when we encounter people that are different than us, we get this generalization, which we make into kind of a rule. This is how those people are. And so when you encounter someone from that group, you immediately assume you're like this. You've got these traits, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is what you like. This is what you eat. This is what your attitude is about work. This is what your skills are. This is what you're good at. This is what these are your shortcomings according to my rules. That is called stereotyping. Stereotypes are really always negative. I treat them always negative, even the positive things. And people say, people from Slovenia, let's say, people from Slovenia are always good looking, or people from Slovenia are always smart, or people from, you know, the Asturias area of Spain are always hardworking, or negative things. And I could say the reverse. I could say the negative of those. But in fact, those stereotypes and those attitudes will mislead you because then you encounter people from that group and they're not like that at all. You know, there may be tendencies, and the word tendency is okay, where you can make some statements, but you really have to check yourself and check your bias because if I say that a certain group of people are always good at mathematics, and then I treat them that way in my classroom, so I don't understand, you know, you're from such and such a part of the world and your math is terrible, you're very weak, you know. I'm not looking at you as a student, as an individual, I'm treating you as some member of a class of people or a group of people, and therefore I deny your individuality. All right. And like I said, even positive things can be negative. because people think you're from such and such a place, you're going to be a really good artist. And that's how I see you in this class. My expectations are you're going to be this way. Okay. And it can be someone's sexual orientation. It can be where they're from. It can be their skin color. It can be their language background. It can be any of these things. And if I have a stereotype with it and I apply it to you, or better yet, if I have a generalization, I apply it to you, I deny your individuality. I always enjoy talking to people from Nebraska, and I say, what do people say about Nebraskans? And there are popular shows where individuals from Nebraska are portrayed. One of them is Penny on The Big Bang Theory. She identifies either from Omaha or from Lincoln, I think, I've noticed on the show. And of course, they say, well, she's very attractive, blonde, kind of a Nebraska girl, but, she's not as smart as the guys because they're, physics guys and stuff like that. So they have their narrow viewpoints on it. Even people that are called nerds, and sometimes people enjoy being called nerds and laugh about it and joke about it. You see shirts, sometimes they have stereotypes, but it all depends on who's offended by it. And so my point here is that kind of keep your mouth shut and observe things and see how people are and treat them for who they are rather than reach some quick conclusion that they have to be a certain way. Because your background knowledge on most of the world is pretty limited. You really don't know anything. I mean, especially if somebody's from a part of the world where you have no background yet. You have no idea. Somebody's from Indonesia and you don't know how to classify that because you never met anybody from Indonesia. Or the worst yet, one time, and this is a funny story, a guy from the United States was in some area of Peru, and he was American, and people were laughing all the time. And they said, well, why are you laughing? He said, the only American we know is Jerry Lewis, who was a comedian with Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis in the 50s. And Jerry Lewis did the Nutty Professor movies before, what's his name did them? Now I can't remember. But the idea is that they started laughing. They thought all Americans are comedians or all Americans are rich. Or as someone told me when they used to watch the show Dallas from back in the 80s and 90s about rich Texans and kind of snobby and they're rich and they're deceitful and they cheat on people and they're unfaithful to their wives. And the guy thought, he said, came to the United States, he said, I thought you were all like the show Dallas, where people have a lot of money and they have great cars and they're all wealthy. You think about it, you say, well, I don't mind you assuming I'm wealthy, but probably not true. So you get all these crazy ideas, and that's because people don't take time to think and to come up with information. So avoid the absolutes. Realize generalizations by themselves are not evil, but when you apply them to people indiscriminately, you're discriminating. I mean, you're taking away their individuality. So that's what I want you to come away from this chapter with. And they talk about what is an effective curriculum. A curriculum that is effective teaches kids to think about how to deal with new situations, new cultures. And those cultures may be cultures of work, of social status. I've mentioned sexual orientation. They may deal with, which is this subject, one of those, both of those really. One of those this week, Out of the Past, is a video that, may make you a little uncomfortable. I don't know, and that's fine. I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to get you to think. And the other one about misrepresentation is kind of early version of sexism in the media, but it's kind of given from the viewpoint of people in the media. So it's kind of elitist in the sense that it's not everyday people, but you run into situations where people have expectations of how women have to dress in public or how women have to behave, or how children have to behave, or how certain individuals have to behave. And they always can lead to conflict and cultural clashes of one type or another. So I'm always expanding. I want you to think about culture in a very broad sense. It's not just language, it's not just ethnicity, and it's certainly not race, which is so artificial. But when you deal with these, you think about conceptually, and I always dislike the term theory, because unless you study theories a lot, most what people have, and they say, I have a theory about this, or I have a theory about that, it's usually a pretty amateurish opinion that people think certain things about people from a certain state or from a certain social class, or people that are on welfare, or people that are farmers. I've heard derogatory things about people of all status in life. Rich people get discriminated against. Not that they're suffering, but the fact is that just being rich doesn't mean you're happy, right? I have a book here. It's called The Color of Words. It's mainly deals with every destructive, either racist or sexist or biased word used against people from other countries, including whites, including every minority in the United States, even people by their job status, if they're fishermen or something. One of the ones that I don't think I'll offend anybody by bringing this one up, it called the French frog eaters. And I thought, frog eaters? I've eaten frogs. Maybe you haven't, but I've actually eaten a squirrel. Sorry. But what's funny about it is that frog eaters, and I've eaten frogs, I thought, why would that be about French? Because in France, they eat the legs of frogs. And I've eaten the legs of frogs, and now I wouldn't do it because they're amphibians, and I'm not really into meat much anymore. But it was funny because I never thought of that being an insult. But I know all the ethnic jokes I've heard all my life. And they can be used, a lot of them are directed against women, a lot of them directed against people that are educated, a lot of making fun of teachers, and we've seen people ridiculing teachers in a lot of states and not wanting to pay them and acting like, every time you've heard jokes about people saying that, well, this kid didn't learn those darn teachers at school, or something more negative about them. So they're anti-intellectual jokes, they're if you're not intellectual jokes. There's no end to this. And so one of my things is to teach people to think very carefully and observe before they make statements, and to explore, not assume, because if you assume things about people, you make a fool out of yourself. I won't give that little word instruction, but when you assume things, what you do to yourself. So Banks makes the argument for a well-balanced curriculum, and to, I think, layers about how we, and it talks about key concepts from multicultural curriculum in the 3rd chapter. Now, what I do want to get in this book is I do want to get into things deeper into the book. One of the things I want to mention, as you'll see if you open it, has Asian, Arab Americans, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, Hispanic, Native Americans, Jewish Americans, European ethnic Americans. So almost all of us are in this book. And even though it's a little dated, it's a good basis for just looking at the history and the depth, and helping people recognize the uniqueness of their own cultural background, even if people think it's the same as everybody else, because it's not. There is no monolith of culture. It's all detailed. So I'm going to shut up for right now, and I just wanted to give you this video so you have it to start the week, and I still have to put up the discussion question.